Thank you very much for attending this session. My name is Gareth Morris. I work at Xi'anjiaotong Liverpool University, and today I'm going to talk to you about expatriate language teacher, employment motivation, and job satisfaction. So, a little bit about me to begin with. Well, I have worked at Xi'anjiaotong Liverpool University for close to a decade. During this time, I've been a module convener for a number of modules. I've taught on many more. I was also the Language Centre DLTC chair and a member of the then Language Centre management team. And I sat on the University Learning and Teaching Committee and also the academic board. At present, I am the head of division for Taitan campus within the School of Languages. And I also sit on the English Language Centre management team. I am a senior fellow. I've completed my Masters in TESOL, a CELTA and a PGCE qualification, and also I have a Bachelor's in Business. And at present, I'm in the process of completing my doctorate. And this study actually stems from that, and in particular, the thesis. So if I begin by giving you a bit of an introduction, well, this study stems from a number of interest areas. One is personal interest. Another is professional interest, and there's also an academic interest in the topic. In addition, a few years ago I conducted a pilot study into a similar area, having moved away from student motivation and, in particular, student motivation and with an employment focus. And I found that actually, during that pilot study, some very interesting and unexpected findings resulted or came up. And that kind of, initiated my interest in this area in particular. Now, the research questions that I specifically looked at were what motivates expatriate English language teachers to work abroad, and more specifically at a certain institution, and also to what extent and in what areas are expatriate English language teachers either satisfied or dissatisfied with their job. So I'm not going to go into too much detail with regards to the defining terms. I think intuitively you all probably know what motivation and satisfaction and dissatisfaction are. I would suggest though that there is an important significance to this study. In particular, there are research gaps it helps to address. It also has resonance with many educators as well as expatriates potentially. There is the chance for it to enlighten management and managers and policymakers, and there's also an impact it can have for the students. So for all of these reasons, it's a pertinent study at an important time, not just institutionally, but much more widely in the areas of international and transnational education. So if I now go into look at some of the backgrounds, well, again, I'm not going to go into too much detail with regards to China. I think you're all familiar with the country and also the importance of English to people here, as indeed to people regionally around Asia or just globally. Suzhou is a city which is located very close to Shanghai. It's a big city by European standards, population of around 10 million people. It has satellite cities and districts. It also is often referred in travel literature as the Venice of the East, or if we go further back in time, heaven on earth, along with another city called Hangzhou. I've already suggested and stated that I work at Xi'anjiaotong Liverpool University, and within this university I work within the School of Languages, and within the School of Languages resides the English Language Centre. Now, the English Language Centre employs over 200 staff, and they come from a variety of different demographic and academic and just generally a wide variety of backgrounds, ages, gender, nationalities. So it's quite a diverse setup. If I was to speculate off the top of my head, I'd probably say there's a 60-40 split between home nationals and overseas expatriate staff. If we look at the teaching which takes place within the School of Languages, well, beyond the EAP provision, there's also postgraduate provision, there's staff English. If we diversify out into the Modern Languages Centre, then you have Chinese, Spanish, Japanese. So it's quite a diverse portfolio of teaching, not only within the school but also within the English Language Centre itself. Now, if I move on to consider some of the literature around motivation and satisfaction, well, a lot of the early sort of seminal theories have overlaps and relevance to both areas. So whether we're looking at the work of Freud or Hull or Maslow or Rogers or Skinner, I think a lot of their suggestions and findings are pertinent in both areas and are applicable in both areas. So the hierarchy of needs, the motivation hygiene theory, theory X, Y, and Z, expectancy theories, goal theories, self theories, all of these are relevant to some extent or pertinent in certain areas. I think the second thing I'd like to focus on with regards to the literature is the fact that teacher motivation, language teacher motivation, teacher satisfaction, language teacher satisfaction, and their negative states, despite having some nuances and differences, as you would expect, there is also a lot of overlaps. So a lot of the factors which motivate or satisfy a general teacher will also be applicable to a language teacher, and I think that's fairly obvious. So I think the two can be considered, almost holistically or together, simply because of the overlaps that do exist between them. In addition to that, I think I'd also suggest that if we consider conceptual frameworks in the distinct area of employment motivation and also within job satisfaction, dissatisfaction for expatriate language teachers, there are some gaps there, however. So it is possible to find conceptual frameworks in terms of, let's say, motivation, in terms of career motivation. It is possible to find conceptual frameworks for satisfaction through a particular lens. But for this particular group, and considering some of the aspects which are going to be relevant to them, then I think, as this study found, it's important to, in many cases, to consider, does something additional need to be initiated? And so with both conceptual frameworks, new ones were proposed or alternative ones were suggested. So for motivation, I would say that employment factors, personal considerations, and convenience are all very pertinent and important when considering what motivates someone to move to a specific place overseas as a teacher. And by the same measure, in terms of job satisfaction once in employment there, then I would argue that although there are many ways to consider this potentially, personal interactions, teaching and learning, recognition and progression, and the employment package, albeit considering as well the environment or the immediate environment and all of the factors which impinge upon that, whether physical or virtual, are also very, very important. Now, if I then look at the methodology which underpins this study, well, I would regard myself as a pragmatist. I've already told you what my research questions were. I won't go into the ontological or epistemological positions. I think if you would like to engage in a conversation about those, then please do. As with anything in this study, feel free to get in contact at any point and I'm happy to elaborate. The research design was exploratory. It was interpretive. My role was openly conveyed. I adopted case studies as part of a research method, semi-structured interviews in particular. There was an interview guide. The research site I've alluded to. The participants were selected on a purposive and convenience basis, which I think is justified. I looked at 4 different groupings: new staff, second and third contract staff, long-serving staff, and managers. The semi-structured interview guide was adapted from an existing one, pilot tested and refined. I conducted all the interviews myself. I transcribed all the data myself. I coded it and looked at the themes or identified the themes. I think that the data quality assurances and the ethical considerations hold up well. And of course there were challenges, but again, because of time I won't go into all of these, but I'm more than happy to elaborate if anyone is interested. So if I look at the results and discussion, because this is where it really kind of gets interesting, I think literature and I believe the results here reiterate the need for looking at these questions, this challenge, through a different conceptual framework. And in terms of employment factors, personal factors, and convenience, it was quite interesting to see what the data showed. Because in terms of employment factors, many staff mentioned that the move to this university in particular was a step up, so they had career aspirations or career designs. The remuneration package was attractive, which is not always the case. Prior work experience, teaching opportunities, and colleagues' recommendations also sort of were pull factors, at least in that employment area. Push factors from previous employment places included changing work situations and also limited alternatives. And I think for an institution, of course, if you have lots of appealing factors, then that's obviously much better than having or being reliant on the external environment. Because if you're reliant on push factors to recruit, that's going to be a problem because you can't really influence any of those and it's out of your control. So that was one interesting set of findings. In terms of convenience, which was the second most prominent area mentioned, well, location was really important to the staff. And in fact, it was the most important feature for all three areas. It was a really, really important consideration. Prior knowledge, recruitment ease, chance adverts were also mentioned. And if we consider personal considerations, well, friends and family recommendations, family and partner needs, the lifestyle, and in some cases, family and partner separations. So these are some of the features which underpinned the motivation to seek employment overseas, or more specifically at this institution. If I now go on to consider the satisfaction and dissatisfaction of the staff, well, in terms of new staff, the areas which were most satisfying were the employment package and some of the teaching and learning. Personal interactions, they were still fairly satisfied with that. Recognition and progression, a lot less so. In fact, it was the primary source of dissatisfaction, whether it was in terms of the evaluation system, promotion opportunities. I mean, it kind of was a sticking point. If I consider second and third contract staff, well, again, personal interactions, generally speaking, were seen as a positive. Management support, not always the case. Teaching and learning, again, it was an area of general satisfaction, I would suggest. Recognition and progression, a lot less so. In fact, this was an area where most were dissatisfied, and in most areas. So whether it was effort acknowledgement, the evaluation system, promotion opportunities, career advancement, the vast majority of the staff, or the 6 staff that constituted second and third contract employees, were not happy in this area. The employment package, a bit more of a mixed bag, but more satisfied than dissatisfied. If we look at long-serving staff, well, again, personal interactions generally were a big positive. Again, management support, not always, but most areas, students, colleagues were deemed to be very good. Teaching and learning, again, mostly satisfied. Recognition and progression, again, to reiterate earlier groups and to re-emphasize earlier groups, this was more of a sort of dissatisfaction. Not as strong as the previous group in terms of how acutely felt it was, but it was still fairly apparent that recognition and progression was not perceived to be there. The employment package, generally still fine. So again, I mean, there is a trend emerging here. Within any particular area, there might be an outlier. So personal interactions, management support was not always deemed to be there. And in fact, it was a problem at the time on a localized English language centre level. Teaching and learning, generally good. Recognition and progression, less so. The employment package, again, generally good. If we consider a final group, managers, well, this group was also interesting because the feelings were expressed less strongly. So again, personal interactions, despite often being removed from the classroom was still a source of satisfaction. And when people could get back into a class, these managers, they often really enjoyed it. Teaching and learning, generally speaking, it was a source of satisfaction. Although there were some areas where dissatisfaction was also very noticeable. The workload was one source. Decision making was another at the time. Recognition and progression, less of an issue, but then you might expect that as these managers have obviously been recognised to get to their level. The employment package, generally okay still, but more of a mix, and that might be because it's harder to go anywhere once you hit a certain point. So these were some of the interesting findings from the satisfaction and dissatisfaction area. So if I wrap this up, because I'm conscious of time, and I'm also obviously more than happy to sort of engage anybody who's interested at all in this topic, then I think obviously this research is valuable for a number of reasons. I've alluded to a few already, but not only is it important on an institutional level, but I think more broadly in the areas of transnational education and international education, it has value. I think for anyone who's employing expatriate staff, it has points which might be worth considering. And in terms of some of the gaps in the literature, whether it's for specific groups, expatriate language teachers, whether it's within a specific area, job satisfaction, employment motivation, whether it's in a theoretical or conceptual area, I think, it helps to address and abridge certain areas. As for some of the areas to improve recruitment and retention, well, this is also being acted on and followed up with additional studies. And of course, there are limitations to the study, and that goes without saying. And throughout the whole process, and not just this piece of research in particular, but also earlier pieces of research I conducted as part of the doctorate, I would say it's been an invaluable experience. I mean, I couldn't be more happy with everything I've learned, and some of the people I've met have been absolutely brilliant. So again, thank you very much for your time. I hope you will have a fantastic day, and if you do have any questions, please do feel free to get in touch. Thank you very much.